Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Circle of Fellows. This is an FIR Podcast Network show where we bring together members of the group of fellows at the International Association of Business Communicators to take a deep dive into a single topic. And today's topic is employee communications, specifically whether it's still a relevant function in the organization, and if it is, how it can be relevant given the changes that have been occurring in the communication landscape, the business landscape. We have two fellows joining me today so far, and with luck we'll have two more popping in. But I have John Gerstner, I have John Clemens. That's the John that I have with me today, and Sherry Rosen. So John, why don't you start off introducing yourself, and then Sherry.
Okay, I'm John Clemens, and I'm Senior Manager of Communications at Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas. I've been a communicator for over 25 years, a member of IABC the same number of years, very involved in the organization. And my responsibility includes supporting Walmart's U.S. Ethics and Compliance Organization. Thank you.
Sherry?
Yes, I'm Sherry Rosen, and I've been, my IABC relationship goes all the way back to college. I've done public relations and publishing and marketing and consulting and social and technology, but the thing that has been consistent for me over all of the years is how meaningful I find employee communication. That's really where I like to be. I work for a bank, a financial services company that is clustered around Texas, which is where I am. Frost Bank, it's one of the highest rated financially, and very deep culture, but if you haven't heard of it, that's okay. That's where I am Vice President of Communication.
Terrific. And Sherry, I just have to note that you were also the author of the Tech Talk column in Communication World back when most people didn't recognize that tech had a role in communications.
That's right.
And now I've moved into Google+, so anybody who is watching this hangout or people who are hanging around in Google+, there's an employee communication excellence group there too, and would love to have you join in.
Yeah, I'll include a link to that in the show notes when I get those posted later today. There's some great discussions that happen in there. People talk about whether Google+ has any potential going forward, considering that it really never took hold the way I think Google was hoping that it would. But those communities are pretty effective, I think.
Yeah.
So let's jump into the topic, and we'll hope that John Gerstner and Amanda Hamilton Atwell are able to join us during the discussion. But I have read, as I noted in the introduction to this, that there is a train of thought out there that says that we don't need discrete internal communications functions anymore. And the rationale is really that because of digital communication, we live in an era where employees have access to all the messaging that the organization does with all of its other stakeholder groups. In the days where everything was print, you could send your press releases to the press and maintain relationships with the media to get the coverage you wanted there. You could communicate with your investors, and then you could send a separate message to employees. And basically, for most employees, that's the only messaging they saw. But today, they can see it all. And therefore, isn't the internal communication audience just another stakeholder audience for the PR department? And it's certainly my argument that no, it's not. That coordination with PR is important, but that there's still a number of reasons to maintain this independent internal communications function. But John and Sherry, let's get your take on this before we start diving into some of the separate issues around it.
Sure, Sherry, I'll let you start.
Well, okay, there are many reasons why I think there is a strong reason or a strong motivation to have a separate employee communication function. And instead of trying to give it short shrift and just list them all, maybe we'll just take them one at a time. But I would say that maybe we can start talking by the fact that the message that we messages that we are engaged in sending to some of those audiences that you mentioned, Shell, are indeed distribution of information. And in terms of what an employee communicator does, I think it is much broader than distribution of information to employees. We are looking to give them, to get them involved in what is going on in the company and the direction of the company, and that takes so much more than simply distributing messages.
Yes, I agree with you, Sherry. I think that they're looking for a point of view, the why in the communications. Anything dealing with organizational change or change in leadership or different strategy or a new focus for the company, that needs to be explained. You need to have a point of view and explain the why to employees. And I don't think that a PR person can do that. I think it takes a strategic internal communicator who has his feet on the ground and he's using his eyes and ears, or her eyes and ears, to listen to what's happening and shaping that message so that it resonates with those employees. I will always think that there is a need for an internal communications function. But prior to the start of this program, Shell, you, Sherry, and I was telling you that I'm seeing a shift in what's happening with internal communications, where some companies are hiring communicators who do the PR, they do the social digital, and they do the internal, and they're taking a holistic approach to all of the communications that needs to be done to reach the various audiences. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just a shift in what I'm seeing happening in terms of moving away possibly from a singular internal communications function to one that is holistic and comprehensive and looking at all channels, all ways to communicate, and looking at all of the audiences.
Right, and John, let's stick with that idea of change for a minute. And it's not so much that PR people aren't capable of learning change communication and change management. It's just that they haven't had a reason to. You don't need to address change with other stakeholder audiences, but where change is being driven by what is essentially our client in internal communications, the leadership of the organization, we're trying to drive very specific change. We're trying to get to where the leadership has decided that the organization needs to go. And that's a skill. It requires a certain amount of study and a certain amount of experience to be able to pull this off. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a relationship between internal communications and PR, right? I mean, Sherry, in your organization, how do you work with the PR department to coordinate messaging where the message is relevant to all of the stakeholder groups, but I don't want to use the word spin, but I will. The spin has to be different based on who the audience is and what their interests are.
Yeah, and it's interesting how people naturally, they default to what comes naturally to them when they're creating their messaging or their plans or their spin or whatever it might be. I do work side by side constantly with the person who does the external communication along with what I do with internal communication, and it's I continually find that if I'm working from a press release, for example, that she's written and trying to adapt it for an employee audience, it's a complete rewrite. It's not just changing the first paragraph. There are different motivations for what you're trying to do when you're reaching an external audience than what the motivations that you're trying to do when you're reaching an internal audience, as you mentioned. And it is a lot about change, because often by the time you've gotten to the point of making a release, some change has happened. So employees have been involved in that change. They need to have been started early in the process, understanding where the company is going to get to the point to make it there. I think that just to answer your immediate question is how do you work with someone, it's a constant. It's not just, a morning stand-up, what are you going to be doing today, but all during the day. What's happening? What calls have you gotten? What feedback have you gotten? How's this working? What's next? And it's just that constant conversation, which sort of leads me into something else that I wanted to talk with you about, because I've heard you and some others talk about maybe where we're going in terms of changing the employee communication function is moving from the title of employee communication to the title of chief of internal conversations, for example, because there's one thing to sending out messages that are just, here's what's going on, and there's an entirely different approach, which is to provide access to information that seeds the conversations that are going on in the workplace, and that those are really the things that change attitudes and they drive behavior, and where we can see some real positives in terms of the communication that we're working on.
John, what do you think about that idea of sort of the facilitator of internal conversation?
Well, I want to go back to another point that Sherry mentioned, the conversations between PR and internal communications, and I sum that up as partnerships. Just very close relationships, partnerships with PR. And I will say that at Walmart, the internal communications function is really less than 10 years old. The company is a little more than 50 years old, and the internal communications function is less than 10. And what's happening now is a more full integration between corporate communications and internal communications at Walmart, which is really great to see. I think those partnerships will grow, and I've seen it with companies, former employers, particularly with Raytheon and Marriott International. There was constant conversation where our executive communicator would bring us together to talk about what are the issues that you're dealing with in internal, and PR doing the same, and we're sharing ideas and collaborating and discussing where there may be, and I know everybody hates this word, where there's synergy between the two. And I think what Sherry's talking about is that synergy, that partnership. We can be facilitators for our executives, and we can be more than that. We can be strategists, we can be business people, which is what they want us to be first, and communicators second. So all of that comes together, and we're seeing a change, as Sherry mentioned, but as facilitators for change and for communications, yes, but even more important is that partnership, talking with the internal constituencies and groups that can help you tell the story.
Yeah, and if I can add one point to what John is saying, I think that it is the synergy, if you will, and it is much more than just once you get to the messaging stage, a much earlier stage than that, the strategy and planning stage. I've seen it work a lot of times where the starting point is for all of the communicators, whether they're in corporate communication or employee communication or marketing communication or whatever it might be, to get together to build a common document foundation, if you will. These are the key points that we see coming through on this project. This is the kind of approach that we want to take with the different audiences. These are the words that we want to use. These are the words that really get to the tone and the voice of what our company has to say about this, as opposed to some of these other words that may not be as appropriate. And then everybody works from this same base document to go off and do what they're working on, and that seems to be effective as well.
Shel, I have a question for you.
Sure.
I have been approached at Walmart and even at Raytheon about segmenting internal audiences where we have boomers, millennials, the Gen Y, Gen X, and that the messaging should be tailored for each of those groups. And unfortunately, in the roles that I've had, I have not been able to do that. And I want to know if, Sherry, you've encountered that, or any other companies that you're hearing about, Shell, that have actually taken that approach to address those various audiences and have segmented it as opposed to one internal communications message that explains the why to everybody.
You know, it's really an interesting dilemma, because demographics are just one of the ways that you can slice and dice an employee population in order to tailor communication to them. Absolutely, you know, there are different values that are held by, say, millennials than by boomers. For example, millennials prefer to have experiences than to acquire things. You know, so talking about the bonus you can get if you perform at a certain level is of less interest to them than the fact that they're going to get to go on a trip if they perform at that level. So, you know, understanding the values and what resonates is important, and I think it should inform communications, but I don't think that you can tailor communications that you're only going to send to that one audience. I mean, you know, there are other ways to look at it. If you know you know much about marketing, you know that they create personas for customers that has more to do with you know, the multiple dimensions of a person than just their demographics. So, you know, you have somebody who's at the midpoint in their career, they're in their early 40s, they're married and have kids. You know, you've seen these profiles developed for marketing purposes, and they probably have some utility in internal communications as well. Then there's location, which I think is a really important dimension of somebody's employment. You know, if you're working in a manufacturing facility in Texas, you probably have different information needs than if you're at corporate headquarters in New York. You know, one more way that you can look at employees is where they are in the employment life cycle. We do this in marketing all the time, in sales too. We look at the customer journey, starting at, you know, I have a need for something, what's available out there, and ending at becoming an advocate for the company they choose to do business with. How many companies look at the life cycle of employment when they're looking at how to craft communication? Somebody who's, you know, just getting their feet on the ground in the organization, all the way up to somebody who's just getting ready to retire. So I think all of this can inform communication, but you know, how many different articles are you going to write, and how are you going to make sure they get into the hands of the right person, as opposed to having the content available for them to find? Sherry, you talked about making sure the resources were available when they went looking for them. So yeah, I'm not so much interested in creating content for boomers as opposed to content for, you know, the greatest generation, as much as I am as acknowledging that we have all of these different generations in the workforce and being aware of the different values and, you know, what resonates with them in terms of motivating them. You know, when I'm crafting communications to go to, you know, get housed on the internet and be available for pulling down or discovery through search, or, you know, linked to in an email or what have you. Mm-hmm. Sherry, what's your view on?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk in that direction, Shell, because we actually do personas for our employee communication.
Oh, that's great.
And we do look far beyond generations. One of the things that I think that's important in doing so is you're not looking at them in terms of stereotypes for generations, but you're looking at people in terms of how they make use of information, what knowledge is important for them to do their jobs, and how they access it. Mm-hmm. And that gives us, that plays on one of the things that's very important in our culture, and we do a lot of training around this for our employees, is to really know their own work styles. So your work style is something that you come to understand, and then you know how it is that you want to interact with people, what kind of information you want, what kind of conversations you're having with people, where you go to find things out. There's just this whole broad range that's involved in that, and it really does become much like a customer journey. It becomes like an employee journey. So we've used employee journey maps and things like that as well.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that I really firmly believe about internal communications these days, and I just made this point at a presentation I did to an internal communications team for an organization yesterday, is that the function has changed dramatically in that when I got into it, say it was in the mid-1970s, it was very publication oriented, and it was you know, the production of communication stuff that got distributed. We still do that. We still need to craft communication materials, but I would say a good half of the role of an effective communicator these days is facilitating the communication that's going on among employees in the organization. So, John, you were talking about the idea of telling the company story. Which is really important. If you know the foundations of employee engagement, knowing the company story is a big part of that, but so is knowing where you fit in the narrative. And I don't think we can create all these distinct and separate communications to help everybody figure that out. I think what we do is we facilitate access to other people that can help you figure that out. So look at internal social networking. For example, if we can help employees find the people who are in their business unit or are talking about their business unit, who are helping to translate those messages that come from the highest levels of the organization, then they can choose to follow those people and connect those dots between what the corporation is saying and how that affects my team, my department, my work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And at Walmart, I think we're doing an excellent job of allowing our associates to tell their story. We have a site on our intranet where they can go and talk about what Doug McMillan, our CEO, if he gives a speech or if he sends out an announcement, we encourage our associates to talk about that. And they're sharing their stories, they're sharing their thoughts, they're sharing their opinions, and creating these connections that are bringing them closer to the company. And some of it is positive, and some of it may be a little bit questionable. I won't say negative, but we're allowing them to have a voice, and that's really important for employees nowadays. They need to have a voice in their organizations, because you can go to work, you spend most of your life at a job, and you mean to tell me I can't say anything, I can't comment, I can't react? That's not a successful company to me. That's drudgery to me. I want to work in an organization where I can share my opinion, and I applaud Walmart for doing that. I also, and the same for Marriott International, and the same for Raytheon and other companies that I've worked for. They're doing an excellent job. And if a company is not opening the doors for communications for their employees, they're missing something.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about employees having a voice, I should point out that that's another critical dimension of employee engagement. Employees who are engaged generally work for organizations where they do have a voice. So let's talk about engagement for a minute, because 9 times out of 10, if the organization say they run an engagement survey and the numbers aren't very good, the CEO picks up the phone and calls HR, not communications. And HR will look at where the numbers were not great, and they'll implement programs. It might be a wellness program. It might be an employee assistance program. It might be a recognition program. But I don't think programs are the answer. I think culture is the answer, right? Just the way things are done around here. So giving employees a voice doesn't necessarily mean opening up a suggestion box on the intranet, right? Having a voice means that baked into the DNA of the organization are the channels through which employees can surface their concerns and share their ideas and know they'll be listened to.
Yes, and you hit on a key point, listening. You can have a voice, but if the company's not listening, what good is it? And Sherry, I'm going to stop there and let you comment, but I think listening is really important.
I will go back. I will agree with you. Absolutely. Listening is very important. I want to go back to what Shell was saying about the need for employees to be able to connect the goals and objectives of the company to their particular job and their particular situation. And I don't want to get too far down the wrong path going in this way, but that brings up the whole question of the role of managers in communication, because managers do play a role in helping the employees understand, the rest of the employees understand how their jobs do relate to this bigger picture, and it puts the onus on us as employee communicators to make sure that we're using our managers in the right way and we're giving them the information and the confidence to have these conversations where they are actually listening to employees and giving the opportunity to express concerns, not negative, as you say, John, but express concerns in a positive way that leads to a direction where people feel that they're included in part of this. I think that is, there are lots of problems with using managers as the intermediary, and if you have an effective media mix in your communication plan, I think that there's ways to get through all of that and bring everybody onto the same page.
And John, you raised the issue earlier of segmenting audiences, and to Sherry's point, where I do think it's feasible for communications departments to segment audiences, it's executives, managers, and staff.
Yes.
Because I think there's definitely a need for communication to managers to help them communicate effectively and play that role in the organization. But before we talk about that anymore, Amanda has joined us. Hi, Amanda.
Hello, Charles and John and
Hello.
the rest of the team. At last, from Africa, I could join you.
Great. And it looks like John Gershner is with us too. So for the second half of this chat, we'll have the full complement. Amanda, can you introduce yourself to the people who are watching, and then John will, and we'll press on with our conversation.
Good day, everybody. I don't know what's the time at your side of the world. It's late afternoon in South Africa. I am Amanda Hamilton Atwell, ABC, APR, and I'm a fellow, as otherwise I would not be a member of this circle. And I have my own communication business, Business DNA, and I've been a member of the IABC for eons, and I'm just passionate about the profession.
Right. Hi, John. Glad to see you.
Thank you, Shell. Nothing like being late for a meeting. Oh, my. The technology is wonderful. John Gerstner, and I have been around IABC circles basically all my life as well. I am an ABC. I have always worked in internal communications or very close to it. Also, intranets have been my favorite pastime. I currently manage and run Communitelligence, and am just delighted to be here, and sorry I'm late.
And you were involved in internal communications at John Deere for, as Amanda said, eons, right?
Yes, for eons as well. Started the program there, and a lot of other things, including a magazine, video program, intranet. And I also did a stint at Florida Blue most recently, also in internal communications.
Great. So that's a Blue Shield, Blue Cross organization, one of the blues.
Yes.
Blue Cross,
yes,
Blue Shield.
Okay, so let's continue with the conversation, and John and Amanda, what we've been talking about here most recently is how effectively you can segment audiences internally in order to deliver tailored messages to those audiences. So, Amanda, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, in South Africa, we have a very unique, perhaps not that, we have the very sophisticated target markets, and then we have the very unsophisticated target markets in the same organization. I work a lot in the mining industry, so we will get mining engineers, highly sophisticated, highly literate, and talking a language that few people can understand, to the miners on the ground level. And so what we tend to do is to primarily look at the literacy level of the people and also the language, because language is a serious problem in South Africa, because, you know, we have 11 official languages. And then we also have the migrant laborers speaking other languages as well. So what do we do to segment our audiences? We look at language, literacy level, and then we have to customize the platforms for these people, because you know, you cannot use mobiles. You cannot use electronic. You can hardly use print. So it is a major challenge.
So face-to-face becomes a critical element in that scenario, and so does the communication skill of the manager, right?
I think I can jump in on that if Amanda is muted. I think the face-to-face is something that communicators may have slighted in, especially in the more recent years with new technology coming in, and I think I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I have always appreciated and have been excited about new technologies, the intranet, the blog, the interactivity that you can get from that. And in this focus, I'm certain that we probably have slighted the manager, supervisor, and the face-to-face communication and the critical role that the supervisor plays in credibility and getting buy-in for messages has much to do about how the supervisor plays that out to his or her employees.
Yeah, one of my, I make my living dealing with digital and social media by and large, but one of my great concerns about it is it makes it easy to abdicate responsibility for using other forms of communication when those other forms will actually be more effective. I mean, we probably all remember that Radio Shack once got some really negative press because it was revealed that they handled a layoff by emailing everybody who would be leaving their jobs rather than sitting down with those people. But, email makes it easy, and I as a manager don't have to sit across the table and look somebody in the eye and tell them they don't have a job anymore. Isn't this part of the role of internal communications is to decide based on our experience and our knowledge what the best channel is for each kind of communication?
I definitely believe that's true, and all tools do not fit all audiences, and
Right.
certainly we have to be cognizant of where people work, whether they're on the road, mobile, on an assembly line in a factory. All of that has to play into what channel we use.
No, and to piggyback onto what John has just said, it's really about the right tool and channel for the right message. And I've always practiced using different channels, but the face-to-face has never gone out of the equation in terms of the communication strategies that I put together. That is really important for our executives to get in front of our employees and talk to them, whether it be through small informal meetings that they have on a quarterly basis, or town hall meetings, or specific department meetings. It's very, very important for our employees to hear from the executives. And Sherry mentioned the frontline managers. The research shows that employees want to hear from their supervisors, but the problem, which Sherry also pointed out, is that there can be some challenges there, that those managers are not good communicators. You can give them all the messages and all the information, and yet all they do is read from that piece of paper. They don't add anything else in terms of those messages, and that's where you have pretty much kind of the frozen middle, where the messages get stuck. But if you can help, and I dare say partner with the HR department to help those frontline managers be better communicators, everybody benefits. But I've seen that over and over again, where you can do everything right for those middle level managers, and the result still doesn't turn out to be very positive.
Which is why it's so important to reinforce those messages through other channels. But I want to dispel the myth that employees want all their communication to come from their supervisor. This is something that Angela Sinicus challenged at an IABC conference. The speaker, T.J. Larkin. And what she said is the problem is the way the question was asked. Who do you want to get your communication from? well, they're going to answer supervisor. But if I ask you where you want to do your shopping, your answer might be Tiffany's. But that's not going to help you very much if what you need is lettuce and salad dressing. So what you need to do is ask, where do you want your communication about company strategy and the business plan to come from? Where do you want your communication about benefits to come from? Where do you know? And what you'll find is if you come up with a list of 10 different topics, employees will probably say, I want to hear from my supervisor on half of them. But they may want to hear from the senior leadership on some of the other ones. They may want to hear straight from the benefits department on others. So, I mean, it's a question of asking the question right, isn't it? Sorry, Sherry, go ahead.
I need to jump in on this. I'm sorry. I think that part of what we're doing is we're selling employees short, that they need to have information given to them, or they need to have things explained to them. And when we're talking about face-to-face, I want to make sure that we include face-to-face as being peer-to-peer, because people are out there talking with their coworkers. Yes, social media can make that a different experience, but much of what's going on in communication internally is people talking to each other. And that's the magic that we can do as employee communicators, is to have a good understanding of what's going on with that. I know that you had mentioned earlier, Shell, about engagement surveys where they ask questions like, do you understand the goals of your company, and do you have a best friend that you work with, and those sorts of things. And that makes it sound like the company has to give you those things so that you can be engaged, as opposed to asking the questions as, what effort have you made personally to get to know the way your company operates and what you can contribute to it? What have you done personally to get to know your coworkers and come to a common understanding of what it is you're trying to accomplish? And put it back on the individual. And those are things that once we build a culture where the individual takes the responsibility for the experience at the company as opposed to something the company gives to you, then I think that we make huge strides in employee communication.
Yeah, Amanda, when you're dealing with employees who are going down into the mine every day, what kind of channels and strategies are employed to make sure that they're on the same page as the people who work in the corporate offices?
The team meeting is definitely the most effective one. But as John just mentioned, is that the poor supervisor is so unable to really communicate to these people, first again because of language barriers and also because of time. So I agree with Sherry that yes, the people must start taking accountability to be informed. But my concern is that organizations provide them with the information, but somehow they do not access the information. And I always say that I'm the international custodian for notice boards, because what I find is that if the team leader or the supervisor shares information with them, and that information is put on a notice board, a tidy notice board, not a untidy, unkept one, and the people can go back and refresh their memories, it works very well to get this conversation that Sherry is talking about going, because then they can stand there in front of the notice board and it can be infographics, and they can say, yes, this is what I understand from this, this is what I understand from this. And that actually, for me, is an incredible tool to get the conversation going, and not only to limit it to the team leader speaking or expecting them to read a newsletter or a brochure.
One of the things that I think most employees have in common, at least here in North America, regardless of the level they're at in the organizational hierarchy, is that they all have smartphones. And I was doing a focus group with a very large consumer packaged goods organization. I was at one of their packaging facilities in Southern California talking to the front line, people wearing the overalls with the embroidered name on it, hairnets, right? And what they have done is embrace the use of the messaging app WhatsApp. Supervisors have created groups made up of the people who report to them. So if they need to get the word out to everybody quickly, we've added a third shift, you'll be coming in tomorrow at 4 a.m. instead of 7 a.m., they're able to send one message and everybody gets it. What's more, any employee who's on the line who needs to get with their supervisor can send a text through WhatsApp, and the manager will get it. What this has done essentially is improve their own efficiency, and they've done this by willfully violating the policies of the organization, because you're not allowed to use a phone on the plant floor. They're also, I should tell you, taking pictures of equipment that's failing and messaging those photos over to the maintenance department, so the maintenance department can see what's wrong, grab the right part, come over and replace it, rather than come look, then go back to the maintenance department to get the right part and come replace it. And it's a violation of policy to take pictures on the plant floor. But they have figured out that these messaging tools enable them to be more efficient. When I asked if they read the intranet, they said no. And when I said why not, they said because we really don't care what's going on 2,500 miles away at corporate headquarters. It has nothing to do with us. I said if I could get you to subscribe to a text messaging service that would alert you to anything going on in your facility or anything about the brand that you're producing here. So, if it's a certain brand of tortilla chip, you'll know when there's news in the brand. And what they said was I would subscribe to that in a heartbeat, and I would read those as soon as they came. So, how important is it then to tailor information using the tools that we have available to us these days? As opposed to these one-size-fits-all communication that are supposed to appeal to the engineers who are, very knowledgeable and very literate, and people who go down in the mine who presumably most of them have phones, but beyond that, are not at the same level as say, an engineer.
Opt-in is important.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I will say at Walmart, there is a site where it's really built for our hourly associates. And they are going into this site to see their hours, their paycheck, what the latest benefit is, and it's very useful. They're not using the apps that you mentioned, like WhatsApp, but this site is key for them. They check in on it every day. But the information is tailored to them. It is for them. It's important information that they want to know because they're following their hours, they're following their pay, they're following if there are uniform changes, they're following format changes in our stores. But we surround that information with other Walmart news. Now, they can read it if they want. They can cherry pick and pick what they want to see, but they are always going into that site to find out what's important to them.
We've talked a little bit about the idea of internal communications being accountable for facilitating communication among employees. One of the things that I run into all the time is a company that will have implemented Yammer or Chatter, for example, and employees will go out and look around and not see much there and never go back. And one of the things that I hear from employees where there hasn't been an effort to really drive the adoption of these tools, we're more interested in deploying them than driving adoption, is that if I don't see my leaders out there, I don't get the sense that I have the permission to be spending time out here myself. So how important is it that employee communication sort of nudge leaders in the direction of being more engaged in communication? And by the way, this doesn't have to just be online. One of the things that drives me crazy when I work with a client is when I find out that all of the C-suite staff, the president, the CEO, and their direct reports, eat in an executive dining room. They don't even eat where employees go in the cafeteria, right? So how important is it that we make the case and provide the means for employees to be able to interact directly with their leaders through the communication channels that we've established?
Well, you've raised two questions. One is adoption and one is interaction.
Yes, good point.
Adoption is something that is new enough that I think we aren't doing well, and we need to work. Generally speaking, employee communicators are not doing well in understanding what our role with adoption is and is explaining its value at the executive level, and then assigning the resources to make that happen. I think that anything that we can do to answer your other question about getting executives and other leaders involved in the daily interaction of staff will only help give people the feeling that they can have those conversations. There's no question that your observation about leaders who are involved in social make a difference in the adoption.
Well, and just a cautionary note about adoption, if you have an internal communication strategy that is working for you, that incorporates executive engagement and the various audiences from non-management to management to senior management, etc., if it works for you, I just find that sometimes communicators want to have the latest and greatest, where WhatsApp or Yabber or whatever it is, whatever app it is, it may not necessarily be right for your organization. So I just add that bit of caution that you do what's right for your organization, not the latest thing, not the latest app, not the latest technology, because if your employees are telling you they are happy, they are engaged, maybe that's not for you.
That's a really good point, John. I think that we need to always be paying attention to solving problems and addressing the pain points, and not just doing something because it's new and exciting and different or what have you, but it also swings back around to the very first question we had when we started this conversation was, is there a role for an employee communication function in this new world? And it points out that there's no one answer for everybody. Every company is a little bit different. The operations are a little bit different. The staff is a little bit different. The situations are a little bit different. So while there may be a specific instance where combining employee communication into an overall something is going to serve the pain points of that company and provide the solution, then that's one thing. I certainly haven't seen it in any of the companies that I've been in. I don't see it in people that I talk to, but I can tell you that everybody has something a little bit different that's going to work for them.
Excellent point.
Amanda, in terms of the engagement, even just the line of sight between the front line in an organization and the leadership, are things different in South Africa?
Shell, for me, it is interesting that the personality of the leader has a significant influence, first of all, in his ability to be an authentic person on the shop floor, because sometimes a leader just doesn't have the personality. He's an excellent leader. He's a strategic thinker and all the things that we need from a leader. But put him on the shop floor and he is so inauthentic and he doesn't know what to talk to the people about, and he just seems uncomfortable, and they're uncomfortable as well. So I don't think that is unique in South Africa. So I think we should take into account that some leaders are not comfortable on the shop floor. We can take them down to a certain level, and then they're out of their depth. But what I also find is that if you put the same leader on stage, not in a literary form, but in front of a group, and he speaks as a leader, he is comfortable, he is convincing. So he's not there on the shop floor trying to seem as if he is comfortable there. And I think that's something that is not unique to South Africa. I think it is the personality of the leader will always have an influence, and sometimes we must just keep him away from the people, profile him as a leader, and take somebody else, perhaps on a different level, perhaps on a different division, to the shop floor that is more authentic on the shop floor.
It's almost like identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the leader, and finding ways to leverage their strengths in order to drive that interaction. I met a CEO once who said he forced himself to go walk a shop floor at least once a month, because that's how he reminded himself that these were all adults. And if he went too long without interacting with the front line, he started to see them as the masses of children who don't understand complex issues and can't handle bad news. But when he went out on the plant floor, where people were doing, blue-collar labor, and started chatting with them, he found, wow, this one is a scoutmaster, and that one is the treasurer of the local Kiwanis club, and this one is helping his spouse run a home-based business. And they're grown-ups. They can understand complex issues, and they can handle bad news. And he said if he missed a month, he started regressing to the old perspective that he had. So at some level, isn't it our responsibility in employee communications to create that connection between the highest ranking and the lowest ranking people in the organization? John Gerstner, what do you think, since we've got you back?
Thank you, yes. I believe you really touched on something that I really believe strongly about, and I did a blog post on this a while back that was titled Less Communication, More Conversation. And it really is this point about, I think we've gone into a lot of rabbit holes as internal communicators. We've delved into technology and a lot of the science and the processes, and we've forgotten that it's really about relationships. And if we think back to the beginning, the mom and pop stores, the small companies, you knew the owner, you knew what was going on, you knew everyone there, peer-to-peer communication. And we have, I think, forgotten this necessity to be very relationship-oriented in our communications. And if we can just rekindle that and express empathy in our communications, I think that's the one thing that an internal communicator must have, is empathy and understanding their audience in a deep way, and really being their advocate. That kind of genuineness, I think, comes across and does a lot for this thing we call employee engagement.
We were talking a couple of minutes ago about adoption, and I think part of the problem, and first of all, I want to say adoption, I don't think, is confined to technology. It could be adopting a new process. It could be adopting a new organizational structure. And what it comes down to really is helping employees understand how embracing this new thing is going to benefit them. Right? Because if it doesn't have anything to do with me, or at least I don't believe, or I can't see how it does, or I don't understand how spending the time to figure this out is going to make my life easier or improve my opportunity for advancement in the organization, or just make me feel better all day long, then I'm probably going to resist, right? So, in terms of the role of internal communications, isn't there a certain amount of explaining how this is advantageous to you is part of our role? I know Roger Dupree talks about, when you're going through organizational change, that it is important for employees to understand the benefit to them of being part of the change and establishing the vision of what this place is going to look like when we get to the other end of this process. And don't you want to be part of that? And people who say, wow, yeah, that's a great vision, I do want to go there with you, are much more supportive of the change initiative. So isn't that sort of a unique role in internal communications?
I'll jump in. Yes, I think that that's absolutely true. Most people will resist change just because it's new and different and hard and whatever. The people who are the early adopters are the ones who can see themselves as a part of that future. the people who are the laggards are the ones who just don't understand how they can be a part of that future. Everything's fine the way it is. It's all of those people in the middle that we need to deal with as well. Over-explaining the new process or the new tool or the new organization or whatever it might be just shuts people down. They're not going to comprehend it until they understand that there's really something that's going to be for them at the end of the road, and that's something that, as employee communication folks, we have to make sure there's a balance of that.
And Shell, adding to what Sherry just mentioned, I actually think you're softballing us, Shell. Of course, we have to explain why something is good for them. It's the with them, what's in it for me. They're all looking for that. If you can't explain that, they're not going to follow you. And to Sherry's point, you're going to always have those people, the early adopters, who are going to say, yes, I'm with you, I'm following you. You're going to always have those on the fence who you need to convince. That's why our role is so important. But then you have that group that will never follow you, that will never accept, that will never embrace, that will never engage. And those are the people, quite honestly, who fall to the wayside. They self-select themselves out, and they realize this is not the place for me, and then they leave. And that's
Gallup calls them the actively disengaged, right?
Yes, exactly, and that's okay if they leave. But yes, we do have a key role there, Shell.
Yeah. But I guess where I'm coming from with this is, for example, if you talk about bringing Yammer into the organization, if you just dump a social network in the enterprise and say, there it is, everybody, Godspeed, people are going to flounder in it, as opposed to pointing out that, one of the biggest challenges, especially for knowledge and information workers, is getting answers to questions and solutions to problems. If you encounter exceptions to the routine in your job, the method people have been using for years is tribal knowledge. I'm going to pick up the phone, I'm going to call someone I think might have the answer. But if you pop the question into the social network, you might actually get an answer from a knowledgeable staff person whom you've never heard of, and you might get it in 5 minutes.
Yes.
And if that improves your efficiency and makes you feel like you're accomplishing more, that's something you want to be part of. So, from a communication perspective, it's not just explaining this, but it's pointing to examples. It's recognizing people who have adopted it well and using them as sort of a case study about what you might be able to accomplish if you use this. So this is the type of communication, almost a marketing role that I see for communicators that target the specific issues that employees are confronting.
And I think it also comes back to having a conversation about the change. Bringing people in to something a little earlier, getting some input, listening to them. Because if you tell me what's going to happen and I sit and listen and that's all that happens, I haven't bought in. But if you ask me, you say, this is what we're thinking about, this is the way it looks like we're going to go, what do you think? When I get to tell you something about that, how I feel, no matter what your decision is, I'm in, because you listened to me. At least you did that. So I think that's the critical thing that we have to keep in mind as we push for change in organizations.
Back to this.
If I can just come in there. I want to, just refer to a bigger change process in the organization. Changing the whole way that this organization of 7,000 people are going to do their work. Now, for me, the role of the communications person in that aspect is that they should be the conscience of the project team, because many things will happen. New equipment will be brought in, new training will be given, new reporting lines will be created. And the communication person, for me, is the one that should be the one to say, okay, we're going to train the people, now we must market the training. We're going to get the new equipment, now we must market the new equipment. So they must, for me, the communications people must be this golden thread that runs through this whole change process. And every time to stop the process and say, okay, how are we going to tell the people about what's in it for them? Because I often see that the project team, the engineers, the project managers just go about and then they assume people will understand and they assume people will get the bigger picture, and they don't. So the communications people, for me, is the critical element in that project team.
Yeah, absolutely, and I would love to continue talking about this with all of you. I could do this all day long, frankly, but we are out of time. So why don't we go around the table and offer one last thought about the role of internal communications in a modern organization, and we'll wrap this thing up. Sherry, why don't we start with you?
Well, I will agree with you that I could have this conversation all day, and I've learned so much from talking to all of you, and I appreciate everybody who's participated. I guess the one thing that I would add is when I am doing any planning around communication, one of the things that I include in my documentation are the risks if we don't do it. What is the risk to the company if this isn't accomplished? And that gets to a lot of the points that we've talked about today. And once the people that I'm working with realize what that risk would be if we don't get it accomplished, if we don't communicate it well, if it's not adopted, if we don't get people talking, whatever it might be, it raises the level of what it is that we do and the importance of employee communicators in the business and the importance of the function.
Great. John Gerstner.
I would say let's open the floodgates to two-way communication. We have been in a one-way mindset for way too long. We have the new tools now, enterprise social networks, etc., to allow employees to speak. Giving employees a voice is so hugely important today. The culture needs to grow into that. It's a long-term change, but I think management needs to start listening more and start sharing more, and the employee buy-in will be there, and that's how we get successful communication.
Terrific. John Clemens.
Thank you, Shell. I appreciate this opportunity to speak today and to be with my colleagues. I really enjoyed it, and like the rest of us, I could listen to this all day, and we ought to get together offline and do this. But I guess piggybacking off of what John said, I think it's about engaging and listening to our employees. I mean, we can read textbooks, and we have so much experience where we can go in and create an internal communication strategy, but it's listening to the employees, getting to the heartbeat, the hearts and minds of our employees. And I know that's a cliche as well, but it's really putting your eyes and ears out in the open with the people who work at an organization to hear what their thoughts are and help you create a program that will work for them, that will resonate for them.
And Amanda.
For me, the role of the internal communications person would be to speak the language of the executives, but also to speak the language of the lowest employee in the organization, and to be able to take the message from the one level to the next level, because we know how to package messages, and that's our role.
And I find it very telling that we've been talking for an hour and barely talked about articles, barely talked about newsletters, didn't talk about video at all or publications. And I think that speaks volumes about what employee communications is evolving into. So I want to thank you all for participating. We'll have an announcement soon about episode 4, what the theme will be and who the participants will be. But until then, I hope everybody has a great month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Shell.
Thank you, Shell.
Thank you.